Everybody. We're having a little technical issue. Please tell me if you can hear me. Tell me if we have sound, because I'm struggling. So let me know. If you can hear me, we'll go forward. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me. I don't know why. I can't hear Michelle. Okay, perfect. As long as you all can hear me, we'll go forward because I don't want to hold things up. But I'm not really sure why Michelle can't hear me tonight. So thanks for letting me know. Welcome, everybody. Sorry to keep everybody waiting. I hate doing that. We like being on time. But for some reason, my moderator, Michelle, can't hear me. So, but looks like everybody else can. So we're going to go forward. Welcome. We've had a lot of new subscribers, so I am just going to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Lori Hellis, and I am a retired criminal attorney, did both prosecution and defense over the years. And I retired about 4 years ago to write. And I am writing a book about the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell case. So I moved to Boise, Idaho to cover the case. And you find us here on sort of a cool and a little rainy day in Boise, Idaho. I'm a quilter, and don't miss in our show notes our True Crime Quilt Guild quilts. You can quilt along with us if you would like. And I have been at the courthouse every day. And so we're going to go over what happened in court this week. I'm going to tell you that I was dead wrong when I thought we were going to wrap up I thought perhaps the prosecution would rest by the end of the week. Last week, a week ago on Friday, and that we potentially could have a case going to the jury on Friday. That did not happen. The prosecution continued for another full week of testimony, but we have to be getting close to the end of their case in chief. So let's just start out with what started on Monday. On Monday, we got Keely Coleman from Bodie Technologies. This was the lab that the newly found evidence was sent to. You might recall that there were a lot of conflicts about discovery and about evidence. And as it turned out, there was at least one hair that was found in the duct tape. I just want to say, for those of you who might be new, I usually sort of give everybody a little recap to begin with, and then I take questions afterwards. So, and it's much easier for our moderators to find questions if you kind of hold them until we get a little further in. So Keely Coleman was there. She was from Bodie Technologies. She was there to talk about the hair that was found in the duct tape. Now, what happened was, this was, for whatever reason, whether it was a small sample or whether it was simply because it was hair and a different scientific process was needed, that test could not be done at the state laboratory. It had to be sent out. So it was sent out to this lab, and Keely Coleman is the senior DNA analyst who analyzed the hair. The big bombshell was that hair belonged to Lori Vallow. Now, this would have been, and as she said, a 1 in 71 billion chance it could be anyone else. But here's the thing about hair. We shed hair all the time. And so it's possible that that hair could have been on someone's clothing, on someone's, I mean, she lived with JJ uh, and lived in the same apartment at different times with Alex Cox, whose fingerprints were found on the plastic. So it's possible that that hair was a hair that was shed and that came off of somebody else's, one of the other people, came off JJ's body, came off of Alex Cox. Had it been that it was touch DNA or a fingerprint, it would have been much more persuasive that Lori was actually involved in the physical um, wrapping of JJ's body, but we don't know. It was still a bit of a bombshell. One of the things I was surprised about was the fact that the defense didn't immediately counter that by suggesting, well, but that hair could have come at any time, right? I was surprised that they didn't work harder at refuting that. So we still don't know how that hair got there. And so it's only moderately persuasive, I think. The next person we had was Rick Wright. He's an FBI agent, and he looked at Alex Cox's phone and Alex's movements. He said he was confident that Tylee came back from Yellowstone. He specifically was looking at the movements around the time that they all went to Yellowstone. One of the things that was unusual was on that night, Alex Cox went back to Lori's house at about 2 a.m. And this was the only time during the time that they lived in the apartments there that Alex went to Lori's in the middle of the night. It was not a common occurrence for him to go. Alex Cox then, the next morning, went to Chad's. He was there between 9:15 and 11:45. This is also the morning of the infamous raccoon text that Chad sends to Tammy. And after Alex is done, presumably burning Tylee's body in the fire pit and burying it, he went to Del Taco and got lunch. Alex bought 60 items at Sportsman's Warehouse in September and October, including a ski mask, a camo beanie, and black rain pants. Of those 60 items, it appears that about 42 of them were gun related. Now, that wasn't 42 guns, but it was gun related ammunition, equipment, and other accoutrements for guns as well. He also, on the 9th of October, which was the day that Tylee's body was disposed of, he got a new burner telephone at Walmart, and he texted Chad Daybell 10 times from that new burner phone. The next person we heard from was Dr. Eric Christensen. He is the Utah medical examiner who did Tammy Daybell's autopsy. He said that Tammy Daybell he diagnosed that there was pulmonary edema. That was the bloody, foamy sputum that she was that was coming out of her mouth and nose. But he said that pulmonary edema is always caused by something else. It is not a cause of death. It's what caused the edema that caused the death. He said the cause of death was asphyxia. The most interesting thing about, now this is the medical examiner who was present when Tammy's body was exhumed, along with Brenda Dye, who was the Rexburg coroner, and was the person who did the autopsy. One of the things that was of particular interest to him was the fact that Tammy had across her upper arms and one spot on her forearm and one spot on her chest, but sort of symmetrically on both of her upper arms, she had bruises, and they were new bruises. He said they were acute bruises, that there was nothing in they actually um, cut into the bruises and looked deep into the tissue and said there was nothing in that tissue that indicated that those were bruises that had started to heal or that the body's inflammatory process had been triggered yet, which means they were very new bruises. And that to him appeared to be, it looked to him like uh, that someone had held Tammy down while she was suffocated. He also said that the body, by the time the photographs were taken at the scene, she already had fixed lividity, which means that when the heart stops pumping, all of the blood in the body, gravity causes it to settle to the lowest part of the body. So she was lying on the bed. That would have meant that her back would have been where all of the blood settled. And he said in a when lividity first begins, if you roll the body, the lividity will move with the body to the lowest point. But after some period of time, it becomes fixed in the tissue and it will no longer move when you roll the body. And so at the point that Tammy's body was examined by the police and by the coroner the night of her death, the lividity in her body was already fixed. So everyone who has weighed in has said that they believe Tammy died more along the lines of somewhere around midnight, and that she certainly did not die just before Chad called 911 at 5:40 and wasn't in that condition at 6:00 when the police came. That couldn't have happened. That she couldn't have just died at 5:40 and been in that condition at 6:00. So it's clear that he said that the cause of her death was asphyxia and the manner was homicide. So that was important. A lot of people asked why her death certificate hasn't been changed yet. Brenda Dye was asked that question, and she said she was waiting for the outcome of the medical examiner and of the trial. So I'm certain that her death certificate will get changed at this point. The next person up was Bruce Mattingly. He's been on the stand before. He's a detective, and he talked about the investigation into Tammy's death. Specifically talked about going and inquiring from the local pharmacies to get her any medication records, and that he had gotten her medical records. And he looked at the medical records and didn't see that there were any issues. There was no report of fainting or seizures. The photos showed that the photos taken at the scene showed that she had a Fitbit that was sitting on her nightstand. So they got the Fitbit and they downloaded it, and it didn't record her heart rate or her sleep patterns. But between October and January, she took 2.7 million steps. So she was in pretty good shape. She was taking a clogging class. She was doing a fitness class that was a high intensity class. And there didn't seem to be any indication that she was in poor shape or any reason why she should have died in her sleep. Now, the next person who was up was, I'm sorry, but I've got several different versions of notes here, so I wanted to make sure that I had the right one. The next person was Audrey Gilbert. Now, Audrey was very interesting because she had a relationship with both Chad and Lori. They lived close to one another, and so LDS wards are usually set up geographically, so they were neighbors and they also went to the same ward together. Um, it, Alice was the Relief Society president, which is the head of the women's organization, and Tammy was her first counselor, which is like her vice president. Um, and they did a lot of things at church, did a lot of activities, and she was someone who saw Tammy at least twice a week. She saw Tammy on Wednesdays when they had their planning meetings, and then on Sundays she saw her for church as well. So she spent a lot of time with both Chad and Lori, and Chad and Tammy. Don't let me make that mistake, please. And Tammy was a person who didn't really like to be in the spotlight, but and definitely liked to keep things simple. After Tammy's death, Emma called her that morning because, of course, she and Tammy were working together at church. Emma called her that morning. Emma is Chad and Tammy's daughter, eldest daughter, and told her that Tammy had died. And Audrey and her husband promptly hopped in their car and drove over to Chad and Lori's house. They got there somewhere around 8:00, and Chad had already made all of the funeral arrangements. When Alice came in, she said she was a little surprised. She asked Chad, "Is this something you already had planned?" Like sometimes people who are getting older, sometimes a husband and wife will make their own funeral plans ahead of time. And he said no. But by the time they got there at 8:00, he pretty much had everything all planned, which she thought was very strange. She was asked whether Tammy ever told her there was something wrong in her marriage, and she said no, but Tammy really didn't talk about personal things. At one point, Tammy suggested that there was some financial stress going on, but she never was really very specific about it, and she didn't talk about personal things. So that morning, they asked everyone if they'd had breakfast. They said no, so they went to McDonald's and brought back McDonald's for the whole family. And Alice said the children were absolutely stunned. They were sitting on the couch and they were just they were so shocked that they could hardly function. And Chad was not that way at all. He very much was hang on. I'm sorry. I am just trying to answer Michelle because I can't talk to her right now. So let me just answer Michelle here because she is trying to help us out with getting another moderator in line. So sorry about that. Sorry for the technical problems. We'll get it figured out though. So anyway, Alice and her husband were trying to be supportive neighbors and friends. So they were checking in on Chad periodically. Chad, they went to the funeral up in Springville, Utah, and they were there with trying to be supportive of the kids. The day of the funeral, Chad said to them, "There's too many people around the house. I can't stay in the house anymore. I'm going to go move in with a friend who has a condo." He didn't say that his friend was Lori, but made it sound like it was a male friend who had a condo, who wasn't home a lot, and who said he could use the condo. But within about a week or so, when she asked if she could drop in on him, he said, "No, I'll come there." So he came in, visited with them. And about another week later, he took Lori over and introduced her to them. So within 2 weeks of Tammy passing, he already had taken Lori over, introduced her to Ellis and her husband, um, told them that Lori didn't have any children, that she had recently had a daughter who passed away. Yeah. And then within a day or two after that meeting, they flew to Hawaii and got married. Um, so then you know how it goes. Um, the welfare check happens. Lori and Chad take off for Hawaii. Lori gets picked up in Hawaii and extradited back. And and Chad comes back. And now this takes nerve. I mean, this takes a lot of nerve. Um, Alice had been very good friends with Tammy. Tammy had been dead 6 weeks, 8 weeks maybe. And October to the first October to February, I think, would be when this happened. And when Chad comes back from Hawaii, he follows Lori back from Hawaii. When he comes back from Hawaii, he sits down with Alice and her husband and asks them if they will put their farm up to secure Lori's bail, to put their home and their property up to secure Lori's bail. He first of all, when he comes back, he asks them if he can move in with them. She says one of her adult daughters is coming to stay with them and that they won't have room for him. And then he asks if they will put their house up to secure Lori's bail. So that's pretty nervy. She talked about the fact that when he brought Lori to visit and introduced her, they were very physically affectionate, very touchy-feely. She'd never seen that between he and Tammy, and it was like they were teenagers. It felt uncomfortable and inappropriate. The next person was Alice's husband, who I believe his name is Todd. He also testified to about the same things. He'd been a little bit friendlier with Chad, especially at church, and so had it, but essentially had the same story that Alice did. And then the next person was Audrey Barattiero. Now, Audrey Barattiero has a story to tell. I need to go back. No, that's right. So Audrey Barattiero was a person who Chad had met through Preparing a People. And Chad asked her to be Lori's friend because he couldn't talk to her all the time. He was trying to get Audrey to sort of, in one way, act as a little bit of a buffer, and perhaps give him excuses to talk to Lori. He asked her to be Lori's friend. Audrey reached out to Lori, and that was in February of 2019. Over the summer of 2019, she saw Lori in Utah at a conference. And her impression was that Chad was trying to keep Lori happy because he was still married. Lori stayed at a hotel. Audrey spent time with Lori Zulema and Melanie Gibb, and there were some other women. And at the end of being there, Lori brought up that she wanted to work on her husband at the time, Charles, to do a casting having to do with him. She started talking about zombies and people being possessed, and Audrey felt like it came out of nowhere. She started talking about multiple probations. Audrey moved to Missouri over that summer, and Lori went to visit Audrey in October of 2019, in early October of 2019, and had Melanie Pawlowski with her, Melanie's. And interestingly enough, this was during that time, Lori went to Arizona, she went to Missouri, she went to Hawaii. It seemed like during that month of October, she was doing everything she could to build an alibi and to not be in town. So the she after Lori and Melanie were in Missouri visiting and looking at the LDS historical sites, then Jim Archibald got up and he started to talk about after that, they invited her to go to Hawaii, to Audrey to go to Hawaii with them. And so she went to Hawaii with Melanie and Lori. And she went there because Lori had said Melanie really needed a friend. She was going through a bad divorce. She'd lost custody of her children. She was not in a good place. And so she really needed a friend. And Audrey seems like the kind of person who's a little gullible and definitely willing to step in and be somebody's friend or take care of them. So then Jim Archibald asks on cross-examination if she'd ever met Charles Vallow. She said yes, and it didn't seem like he was someone with a demon inside. He points out that Chad told her that not only was had Chad been Methuselah in another life, but also had been James, the brother of Jesus, and also told her that she had been married to Jesus. So that was new and exciting information to her. And Jim Archibald asked her about whether or not she felt flattered by that, and why it was that Chad was always someone important and never some loser, as he said. She said, "I thought it would be true because I trusted him." She agreed that if Chad could tell the past, then she would think he could predict the future too. And they all went back to Rexburg, and they all ended up at the temple. She went back to them with to Rexburg, went to the temple with them, and then on redirect, the district attorney, the prosecutor, then asks about what happened the day that she ended the friendship, that Audrey ended the friendship. And Audrey says that she was very uncomfortable, that she really wanted to get out of there. She told Lori she was going to go upstairs and pack and go to bed so that she could get up early and leave the next morning. She said that Chad told her that Tammy would die before the age of 50, before, or I guess about the time he met Lori. So as Audrey is going up the stairs to pack her bag, she says to Lori, "Is there anything weird going on that I don't know about?" And Lori says, "No." And then Lori starts laughing, and she says, like laughing at somebody that you're making fun of. And Lori said, "You're so naive and too trusting. You're like a little child. You'll believe anything anyone would tell you. You'll believe anything anyone would tell you. You think the world is all unicorns and rainbows if you go around helping people, serving them. Well, I've got news for you. Not everyone is a good person, and not everyone can afford to be so nice and kind." The state then asks her to focus on the threats, and she says, Audrey says, Lori threatened to kill me. And the state says, and did she say how? Yes, she said that she would cut me up. Something about that she wasn't in the mental place to do that, but she would get herself in that place to be able to do it. That she didn't want to have to because it would be so messy, because of so much blood and the bleach and something about trash bags, and that she would bury me where no one would ever find me. So that was some pretty explosive testimony considering the condition of Tylee's body and some of the things that have happened in this case. That was the end of her examination, and the next person to come up was Vince Kayakamanu. Now, we've heard from the Fremont County Sheriff, Vince Kayakamanu, before. He's been on the stand before. We also heard from his sister. His sister was the 911 operator the night that Tammy Daybell, that the morning that Chad called 911 for Tammy's death. So Kayakamanu comes on and says he is the sergeant over the detective division, and he is there to talk about October 19th, Tammy's death. He reviewed an email that Tammy had sent to her son, Mark, about the paintball incident that had happened on the 9th of October, 10 days before. She said at 9:15, she backed into the driveway. She said the paintball gun had a hopper on top and that she heard the clicking and whooshing of an empty paintball gun, and said that the guy just kept pulling the trigger. The guy ran off around the north side of the house. They suspect, the neighbor later said they suspected it was a bipolar teenager that lives up the street. Tammy said that she continued to hear that sound. But let's remember that the gun that Alex was using very likely had a silencer on it, and it could very well have been what she heard. He then went through the geofence information that they set up on Alex Cox's emails. So what a geofence is they get a warrant, and it means that they can set a perimeter, and they can ask for any cell phone that was in that perimeter between certain times. So they were able to discover that that Alex Cox's telephone was, first of all, was showing up internet searches, and they were internet searches about the performance of the AR style rifle that he was using. There were also, on the 1st of October, there were searches for Brandon Boudreau's new address, which nobody else had but Melanie's. And then he searched for directions on the 2nd. Then on the 8th, which would have been just before Tammy was shot at, he was Googling to find out what the drop is for a 6.5 Grendel, which was the kind of gun he was using. Drop meaning the amount that gravity will cause the bullet to drop. He also Googled AR-15 style rifle operations in cold weather. The geofence showed that he was in the area around 10 p.m. On October 8th. But interestingly enough, his device showed that he was at the church a mile and a half or so away from the Daybell property. But interestingly enough, none of Chad Daybell's devices showed within the geofence, which means he must have turned them all off, because because all the evidence points that he was at home when Timmy was shot. There was some cross-examination about the guns, and they determined that they wanted the guns brought into court, and so they broke for lunch and then came back and brought the weapons into court. They set them up on a table, and then they had the detective talk about them, hold them up so the jury could see them. One of the things that comes up is the fact that this gun is not a paintball gun. It doesn't have a paintball hopper on top. But what it does have is a very large sight, like maybe even an infrared sight, and it's big. And so when the state comes up, they then talk about the fact that the silencer or the sight could have been mistaken for a paintball hopper. And the officer also talks about the fact that the barrel is threaded and very likely could have had a silencer on it. There was some evidence earlier on that Alex Cox actually bought the materials to make a suppressor or a silencer. So now, then the big hoo-ha happens over the Pawlowskis, over Ian and Melanie's. We had heard that they were in Boise. We'd heard they'd been seen coming in and out of the courthouse as early as Monday. So we get to Wednesday and we still haven't seen them. Everybody's like, what's going on here? So as it turns out, there is some discussion about whether or not either or both of them have watched or listened to testimony in violation of the court's exclusion order. Because there is an order that the judge made that said witnesses were going to be excluded and could not listen to or watch any of the news coverage or testimony prior to testifying. That was the big issue with whether or not Larry was going to be in the courtroom. So there, we had a fairly long motion first taken up outside the jury, and the prosecution had shared with the defense the information that Melanie had been listening to the testimony and reading articles. So the judge brings Ian in and asks him about whether or not he has been listening to any of it. He says he has not, but that he knows that Melanie did because she was interested in what her former husband, Brandon Boudreau, had to say, because they're in some sort of a child custody dispute. So, he denied that he had listened to anything, and the judge said, fine, he can testify. So one of the things that was interesting was that Ian and Melanie met and 10 days later got married. They went to Vegas to get married, and the first he heard about all of these odd religious beliefs. Now he's LDS too, but the first he had heard about all these strange religious beliefs was the night they got married, and Melanie sat down and told him everything about what had been going on. Now, Ian's children were there in Las Vegas with them that weekend. And they sat down and talked about it. He wrote some notes. We know, and this didn't come up at trial, but we know what happened was that he had a laptop that he sat down and took some notes on. It later ended up with his former wife, and she found these notes and rightfully so got pretty freaked out. she called him and said, "We're going to the FBI." That's how he got in touch with law enforcement, and how he ended up recording some. I don't know whether they were phone calls or meetings with Lori and Chad. He then says that he did those recordings, but Lori and neither Lori nor Chad said much of anything that was incriminating. They did tell him he was disturbed by the people who he said were Lori said were dark. He made an interesting comment, which I think really goes sort of to the heart of how current LDS doctrine got so warped by these folks. He said, "The church is a living thing. Faith in revelation, it is oh, I'm sorry. He said the church is a living thing and that he has faith in the power of revelation, saying that both the the both the prophets and the everyday person can have revelations as to what God's will is, and that changes the church, that it is a living thing." So he was open and keeping an open mind to these new things that were coming along, because he was being told that they were had come from revelations, and that those revelations can come either from the Lord's servants or directly to the person. He was upset about the people they said were possessed because they were mostly law enforcement, and he was put off by the idea that law enforcement were dark. Lori said that Detective Hermosillo and Hope were the darkest. There were numerous things that concerned him, but the morning after he and Melanie got married, she shared everything, all of her fears. They were staying in a hotel we were staying at the Bellagio in Las Vegas, and his children were with him. When he got up, his daughter was missing. He couldn't find her, and they just went nuts, of course, looking for this little girl, trying to find her. It made him terrified. They finally found her. She was hiding in the hotel suite, and but less than a week later, they got married November 30th of 2019, and less than a week later, he went to law enforcement with his concerns. Law enforcement then asked him to record the conversations. Lori and Chad told him not to cooperate with law enforcement, and Chad told them to get out of town. The defense then wanted to offer the recordings that Ian had made on cross, and after the judge considered the arguments, he denied that motion and did not play those. One of the things that's been interesting is that the Fremont County Sheriff has been in the overflow room almost the entire time. And it's been interesting to talk to him, the elected sheriff. One of the things he said was that they have not gotten any assistance from the state, and that those two small counties are having to bear the entire expense of this trial and everything that goes along with it. Let me just see here. So after a couple of rounds of motions and complaints, they determined that they were not going to play the recordings that Ian had made, mostly because those recordings, there are other people on the recordings, and that they would be hearsay. So So Ian did say in his conversations with in his testimony that Chad and Lori were giving blessings left and right. He said blessings were flying around like flies. Chad and Lori were giving blessings left and right. Chad and Lori said there were hard times coming for the next few weeks. Ian felt that Melanie had been manipulated and taken advantage of in one of the darkest times in her life. It looks like Lori was trying to take advantage of Melanie. Then they're done with their cross-examination, and the defense says they don't want him released from his subpoena because they're afraid he won't come back. He's there with his Idaho lawyer, and his Idaho lawyer says, I'll accept service of any subpoenas, and I will give you our assurances he will come back if he is subpoenaed. Now, we all expected that the next person up was going to be Melanie, and we were going to hear all about her violating the court's exclusion order, and we were going to hear about all of the issues surrounding her perhaps contempt of court. And we didn't. The next witness was called, and it was Taylor Ballard. So we were all a little surprised. What we later found out, because Nate Eaton knows the attorney that was representing Melanie and called him. What we do know is that the prosecution decided not to call Melanie, and by the time Ian began his testimony, she was already on her way back to Arizona. And they decided not to call her, not to expose her to potential contempt of court, but she does remain under subpoena in case they need her testimony. So at this point, they're going forward without her because I think they feel like it's a big liability. So then the next person that we heard from was Taylor Ballard, and Taylor Ballard was able to testify. She came in and she was the health insurance broker. So she testified that Chad Daybell, after Tammy had died, went to see her about getting health insurance because his health insurance was through Tammy's employment with the school district. He initially said he wanted his kids, Seth, Leah, and Mark, covered. She told him that the Medicaid rules in Idaho had recently changed, and she thought he might qualify for Medicare in January, so he would just have to pay October through December. She said she doesn't usually do this, but because of his situation, she helped him apply for Medicaid. She helped him get on the computer portal and do all the applications. They got back to her and said that his income was too high when he provided his tax returns, and so he didn't qualify. He only qualified for a tax rebate. He never mentioned Lori Vallow. He asked about adding a wife if he got married, and she told him it had to be done within 60 days. And so he didn't qualify for the Medicaid coverage, and he never mentioned any children being involved, other than by that time just his son, Mark. So then he went back to see her in March after Lori was brought back from Hawaii and explained to her that he was concerned that she wouldn't have health coverage after she got out of jail and that she was going to be getting out of jail within the next week or so. So he apparently at that point believed that he was going to be able to find somebody to put their property up to secure her bail, and she was going to get out. It's also interesting he was trying to get health insurance for somebody who doesn't need to sleep, doesn't need to eat, doesn't go to the bathroom, and doesn't go to doctors because they're a translated being. Isn't that interesting? So, um, the next person up was Angela Yancey, and they asked her questions about Tammy's life insurance, when the increase happened, those sort of things, which we already know about. And finally, they called Colin Nesbitt from the Kauai Police Department, and he came and talked about what had happened in Hawaii. First of all, that he had served Lori with the court's demand that she produce the children to prove that they were okay, and that she'd ignored it, and then talked at length about the warrant that was served on their rental car and the warrant that was served on their apartment there, or their condo there. So there was plenty of discussion about that. Then on Friday, we had mostly the agent, and why don't I have, I do have, the FBI agent, whose name right now escapes me, who was the person who went through all of Lori's iCloud account. He was responsible for going through thousands and thousands of iCloud messages. And we got to the, I'm missing that page of my notes, but I will soldier on. We got to the point where he was talking about the iCloud, Lori's original iCloud, and then the new account she got the last few months, because they stopped using any of those devices. Doug Hart, thank you. I knew somebody'd have it for me. She stopped using those accounts, which was interesting, in November. So at the time that the welfare check was done and they vamoosed to Hawaii, they stopped using those accounts. And I think they went to strictly burner phones. There were a few interesting things. There were conversations about the death of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy between Chad and Lori. They characterized JJ, Tylee, and Tammy as obstacles to their being together. The police identified October 26th as the day that Chad and Lori met, and in 2018 at the Preparing a People conference in St. George, Utah. And by the 28th, she was creating a contact for Chad called Bishop Shumway, so that she created the contact the last day of the Preparing a People conference, and their first, it was shortly after that they each got burner phones so that they could continue to communicate with one another without having it show up on their main device. There were a lot of different text messages that were exchanged back and forth that he went through. He talked about the Chad acted as a quasi-religious leader, and Lori sort of was conveying his beliefs. That it was common that people would ask Lori to ask Chad about religious things. She was kind of his mouthpiece. In March of 2019, she wrote "Charles's Body is Alive" to Mel B, to Melanie, the day before Charles was murdered. They have an elaborate plan. I'll call you soon. It's coming to a head. This week will change everything. I will be like Nephi. Nephi was instructed by God. This is an aside. Nephi was instructed by God to kill Laban. Um, John Thomas was objecting all over the place to this. It was a very interesting LDS duel because they all know LDS history. The agent seemed to be LDS too, because there was a lot of like little, I don't know, just seemed like everybody knew LDS history and they were going back and forth on it. He then went through the text to Cole and Zach Vallow about Charles's death, that Lori had texted them to tell them that their father had died, wouldn't tell them how he had died. And there was a little bit of it. There was a little interesting little tidbit, and that was that apparently at one point, Brandon Boudreaux had invited this person named Allie Bloomer and her husband. Her husband was in law enforcement and they were members of the church. And Brandon had invited them over to try and talk some sense into Melanie about some of these strange beliefs. And the text message was from Chad, between Melanie and Chad. I will check Allie Bloomer and husband. Good idea. Chad Daybell says Allie Bloomer is 4.1 dark and her cop husband is 3 dark. I suppose Brandon doesn't know yet about Charles' texts. So it was clear that they were consulting Chad to find out who was dark and who was light. They were friends of Brandon Boudreaux's, and he brought them over to talk to Mel. There was an interesting text from Chad, which I had not seen before, from Chad to Lori. And he was saying, I probably can't be with you on these dates in late, I want to say it was late July. Maybe it was June. I can't remember. And because Leah and Adam and Matt are all walking in BYUI graduation, and we're going to have a house full of people. And then he was saying, I think she'll be gone by then. I think meaning Tammy. So it was very clear from that this was something they had been that they had been waiting for and anticipating for quite a while. So that sort of wraps up the testimony, and I guess we probably should talk about what comes next. So I don't know that there are that many more witnesses to come. This witness wasn't finished, so they'll go back to him on Monday. But in the meantime, I don't know how many more witnesses they have that they can call. It seems like their information that they have presented has been pretty exhaustive. But I think they really, if there is more information that actually creates the connection between Lori and the conspiracy, I hope that's what comes next. But I think we're really toward the end of the prosecution's case. I think they're going to rest very soon, and then I think the defense is going to take over. What's the defense going to present? I think most of what the defense is going to present is going to be information that has to do with that notice of alibi they filed, as to, putting on witnesses who can say, Lori was with me, she wasn't even in town when it happened. So beyond that, I don't know that there's a lot more that they can put on. We have 1,412 people in chat tonight. Thanks so much. It's amazing. It seems like every week we increase our folks that are in chat, and every week we increase our subscriptions. So we're edging on to 9,000 subscribers now, and I can't thank you enough. So tell your friends, and let's get over 10,000. Then we could start thinking about merchandise. Maybe. So I think we're ready to take some questions. Before I do that, though, I want to let you know that I'm working on a newsletter, and this one is going to be a doozy. So look for it, I hope, sometime next week. Now, remember, I'm headed to LA on Monday and down to go do wedding week with my daughter, and her wedding is next Saturday. So, but I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to finish this newsletter I'm working on sometime within the next couple of days. And because I'm taking a deep dive into what the instructions will be for the jury. So what it is the jury has to look at when they're deliberating, and then trying to do my best to plug in what I think the evidence is that proves that particular point. This is an exercise that I would have done if I were trying the case. Oftentimes, lawyers start with the jury instructions, which is what the jury uses to deliberate, and work back. And so that is often an exercise that lawyers would do. So I'm going to do it for you all, and hopefully you'll have some insight into how the questions the jury is going to be having to ask themselves. Tara Wells, are there pieces of evidence they won't share in Lori's trial that will hold for Chad's, or will they share everything they have at both trials? I think they will share all of the relevant information. The only thing that won't come in at Lori's hearing is anything that was excluded because of the late discovery. I need a drink of water. So if there is information that is relevant, it could come in at Chad's trial, but it wouldn't come in at Lori's because the judge excluded some of it, particularly the jail calls, is my recollection. So, but typically they will share everything relevant at both trials. Now, there may be information that's relevant to Chad and not to Lori, because remember, Lori is only charged with conspiracy to commit Tammy's murder, and Chad is actually charged with the murder. So I don't know whether there'll be additional evidence brought in to try and prove Chad is the person who actually asphyxiated Tammy. We're off to a good start. So far, it doesn't look as though Lori is going to throw Chad under the bus. Do you think she's told her lawyers not to do that? Absolutely, I think she's told him not to do that. Otherwise, they would have been in there head first. I think that she certainly has said, I'm not going to turn on Chad. And that doesn't surprise me, because I think everything that we have seen so far is that she's still absolutely a true believer. She believes she is a goddess and he is the prophet. And this is only a minor bump in the road in their journey to lead the 144,000. Emily Louise, how are things looking for Chad in your opinion? Well, I think they're looking about the same as for Lori at this point, because everything we've seen points to them both being knee deep in it, in the thick of it. I think if anything, it's a little worse for Chad, because he can be placed on the property at the time that the children's bodies are being disposed of, and he certainly was at home when Tammy died. So I think there is about a 50-50 chance that Chad goes to trial. And we can talk about that trial setting. It's absurd. So when they went to talk about scheduling, and no firm date was set, remember that no firm date was set. When they went to talk about the scheduling, um, the prosecution said, well, we don't want it too close to the holidays, so if it's going to be in the fall, it needs to be, in plenty of time so it doesn't cause problems with the holidays. And then um they said, oh, and by the way, March, April, and May don't work very well for us. And so then John Pryor said, well, we'll take June of next year. And the judge did not decide when the trial would be. I sort of suspect he's going to want it done this year. I don't really think he's going to want to, I don't think he's going to allow it to go over into next year, but we'll see. Um, I think at this point, not only has John Pryor had the benefit of sitting in trial every day and seeing the evidence and seeing the way the prosecution is conducting the case, but he's also had plenty of extra time to look at all that additional discovery that didn't come in because it was late for Lori. So I think there's about a 50-50 chance that he goes to trial, and I think that, it's as likely that he will enter a plea. I think there's a real, challenge for due process and equal protection if Lori gets the, death penalty taken off the table and he's still facing it. So and frankly, the prosecutors don't wanna try this case again. They've had all they can take of trying this case. They'll do it if they have to, but they'd much rather not, and so I think all those things point toward, perhaps them making him a deal. My understanding is that deals were offered to Lori, but that her attorneys were adamant that they wanted her to serve her time in a mental health facility and not in prison, and the state wouldn't agree to that. I've heard that. Now, I have not been able to confirm that information because we can't talk to any of those folks before the trial is over. So don't run out there and start reporting that stuff as fact. It is a rumor that I heard from a pretty good source, but still just an unconfirmed piece of information. So, how successful do you think an appeal will be on the 404B evidence? You know, of everything, I think this is the issue that might get them a new trial. I don't know. Um, in looking at the Idaho case law, I think they really kind of were right on the edge. I think they really were walking the wire when it comes to how much information came in. I think, and maybe more than I would have been comfortable with, if I were the prosecutor, thinking, "Judge, you're kind of letting in more than I expected." Now, the prosecution obviously is going to put on everything they let them put on because they want to put as much evidence in front of the jury as they can. But going into all of the details of the investigation surrounding Charles, it was one thing to say Charles Vallows was murdered. He was murdered by Lori's brother, who claimed it was self-defense, and to go into all the reasons why it probably wasn't self-defense. But to continue to go on through the details of the investigation are it was a lot, and it was a lot accumulating for the jury, and I was in the courtroom when that information was being, presented, and the jurors were shocked. They were stunned to hear that not only had Brandon Boudreaux been shot at, but also Tammy Daybell had been shot at. And not only that, but Charles Vallow was dead. And so I think that it had a big impact on the jury. And that sort of goes to whether or not it was permissible to go that far. So I think that's going to be a big question on the appeal. I think the two things that are going to be the big issues on appeal are going to be the speedy trial issue, the fact that it was 42 days beyond her speedy trial right window, and and the issue of all that extra character evidence coming in, or that extra information about other crimes. Good questions. I am I love the fact that y'all have been have been watching me for months now, and before that on other shows, and you've gotten quite a legal education, and so we get these questions, and they're good legal questions. They're not just lightweight questions. So I'm always impressed by our audience and how with it they are. Hello, Lee here. If Lori gets convicted in Arizona, does she stay there to do her time, or is she extradited back? Usually what happens is you serve your sentences in the order that they are ordered. So she would come back to Idaho and she would serve her sentence in Idaho until it is finished. Now, we're assuming she is going to get life without parole. And if that's the case, then the sentence in Arizona might be moot. But remember, it's sort of the belt and suspenders, because you definitely always want to have a backup. And certainly they would have a backup in the Arizona charges. So if for any crazy reason her case were overturned, and it were overturned in a way that let her go free, she would still have to go to Arizona and serve her time there. So it's good to have a backup, and that doesn't always happen in cases because they don't always go between two states. But in this case, it makes sense. Thank you very much, Jam, for your super chat. Just want to remind everybody that all of your donations that come through super chats or through our PayPal portal go directly to our moderators. So thank you very much, because I am able to pass that on to them, and you all are a blessing to me, and I get to be a blessing to them. Why are written text messages between Lori and others considered hearsay? Well, anytime that you have a statement that is made from one person to another, it's hearsay. And unless it falls into a specific hearsay exception. So the hearsay exceptions that have been most used during this trial are whether or not they are statements of a party, or they are because we assume that the parties are not going to make are going to make their own incriminating statements. And then the other one is things that are not being offered for the truth. So things between Lori. Oh, and here it's not hearsay if it's a communication between co-defendants. So that's the other one. So between Lori and Chad, between Lori and Alex, those come in even though they are considered hearsay, because they are either statement of a party or a co-defendant. Then we have to get into what the other statements are and who they're between and what they say. So it depends upon the people involved and the specific message. I understand what you're saying, that it's a written text message. So that's the proof that it's like a business record. It's recorded. And a lot of those text messages did come in under the business record exception. So there's an exception for business records that are collected in the ordinary course of business, because The reason hearsay is not allowed is because it is less reliable. So, in an instance where, for instance, the phone company automatically records your text messages, that information is produced in the ordinary course of business and is considered to be more reliable. So, some of the text message records did come in um, in the GPS and CAS data that was put on earlier. There were some text messages included because they were included in that carrier's business records. Hopefully that makes sense. So there are many exceptions to the hearsay rule. And one of them is business records. That's why you saw every time one of those things would come up, you would see the prosecutor saying, and here's our cover sheet that says that this is our declaration that this is a business record. And so certifying the business records. What it means is they don't have to bring in the custodian of every one of those business records to testify. Yes, they're gathered in the ordinary course of business. Yes, they're done through a reliable process, blah, blah, blah. Right. So, um, yeah, hearsay's, it takes a career as a lawyer to start to understand the hearsay rule. Bumblebee. Do you believe that the state is proving their case beyond a reasonable doubt? I hope she never sees the light of day again. Well, you know, that depends a lot on the jurors. I do have some concerns that the link. Now I talk about the fact that circumstantial evidence is like a links of a chain, and they all have to connect. And I think the link that links her directly to the conspiracy is a little weak. I think as it applies to Tammy, I think it's stronger, especially with the Zulema's testimony that she overheard Lori talking to Chad about the fact that that Alex had missed Tammy when he took a shot at her. So it's clear she was involved in that conspiracy for Tammy. Now, can we sort of infer from that she was equally involved in the conspiracies around her children? I don't know. That is going to depend on what the jury feels, whether the jury feels that connection has been made adequately. I'm a little concerned about it at this point. But I'm going to go through and in the newsletter and look at each element that needs to be proven, what the jury needs to find, and then what the evidence is to support it. And hopefully we'll all have a better idea of that once that's synthesized. The other thing is that we don't always understand how the prosecution's theory of the case fits together until we get to closing arguments. So it will be interesting to see how they synthesize all of that into a cogent closing. Good questions. Jenny Meow Meow. If Chad pleads guilty and the trial is averted, will all the discovery be released to the public? Yes. There is some concern on my part that they may be resistant to releasing all of the discovery materials until after Chad's trial, even though the Freedom of Information Act requires that they release it after cases adjudicated. They may say, well, Lori's adjudicated, but Chad isn't. So I don't know for sure that they're going to do that. I'm going to submit Freedom of Information Freedom of Information Act requests as soon as there's a verdict in Lori's case, and then we'll see what they say. But as soon as Chad pleads guilty, then definitely everything would be released. Now, in Idaho, they have an exception that says that they don't have to release all the records until the case has been adjudicated. It's not that way in Arizona, which is why we got that big data dump out of Chandler and Gilbert early on, because they had to release things under the Freedom of Information Act. Good questions. But I'm going to be out there arm wrestling them to get that information, as well as to get those damn documents that are in the court file unsealed once and for all. I'm going to be arm wrestling somebody for that. Hi, Gail Swift Fernandez. Do you think the judge will allow the agent to read the email where Lori gave Chad an ultimatum, her or me, then she left for Hawaii? Yeah, I think so. I think it's possible that one could be coming in shortly. It certainly will come in against Chad, but yeah, I think so. And he's not done, so I'm sure that we will see a lot more of those messages out of the iCloud. But I'd be surprised if that didn't come in. Yeah, where she says, "Oh, go live your life and don't consider me," because she's doing the poor me thing. Yeah. Hi, Judy. Um, Good question. We've talked about this before. So, in the state of Idaho, if you are a court-appointed attorney, you have to meet certain qualifications. You have to have certain certifications, including if you are going to try a capital case, you need to be death penalty qualified. However, if you are a privately retained attorney, it is up to your client, the person who hires you, to determine whether or not you are qualified to represent them in their particular case. And it is not required that every attorney who does a death penalty case be death penalty certified. That is only required if you are court appointed and the taxpayers are paying for you. If you are privately retained, it is up to you to decide whether or not your attorney is qualified. So, John Pryor is not death penalty qualified. However, he is an experienced attorney. He's been doing criminal law quite a while. I believe that he has consulted with an additional death penalty attorney. He has a mitigation specialist who's very, very experienced, who is working with him. So I think that has an adequate team. It's very difficult to do a death penalty case with only one lawyer. Usually you have more than one lawyer just to carry the workload for the preparation. But he's not required to hire an additional attorney and not required um, to have somebody that has to be brought up to speed. It is possible, and I think probable from just things he said, that there are other people sort of consulting with him or working sort of on the peripheral or on the perimeter of the case, that are death penalty qualified. I'm sure that he's been consulting with those folks. So, wow, 1,400 people in our chat. That's amazing. Flashback. Don't you think Lori will be unable to resist testifying? She's consumed with justifying her actions, that her actions are sanctioned by God. Lindsay Blake will have her singing like Jack Nicholson. Well, I assume you're talking about Jack Nicholson in Officer and a Gentleman. Yeah. Or no, not Officer and a Gentleman. What? Oh gosh. A Few Good Men, I think it is. Yeah. I I don't know. My gut reaction has been that I don't think she will testify. But I have been wrong before, and I could be wildly wrong. Most people thought Alec Murdoch would take his lawyer's advice and would not testify, and he got on the stand and made a mess of it. So, yeah, at this point, I'm still standing by. I don't think she'll testify, but it is possible that she may determine that the only answer is to testify and tell everybody about what God has sanctioned her to do. I need to close my office door. Sorry about that. Had husbands and dogs walking up and down the hall. Why haven't any charges been made in Brandon's attempted murder? And how is it hearsay when it's an FBI investigator delivering the evidence collected during the investigation? These are great questions. So nobody has been charged in Brandon's attempted murder because the guy who did the shooting is dead. And I don't know that they have been able to sufficiently connect anybody else. It's clear that it was a conspiracy, but that would mean that the state of Arizona would have to connect those dots and say that they conspired to attempt to murder Brandon Boudreaux. It's not outside the realm of possibility, and it may very well be that they're holding off on those until after they get her arraigned on the charges for Charles's murder. I think they are taking them in order of significance, and certainly conspiracy to commit murder is a more serious crime than attempted murder, only by small degrees, but it is. And so they may be just waiting. The statute of limitations hasn't run yet, and they may just be biding their time. So we will wait to see what happens with that. I think it's a little harder to make the case, and especially since Alex is dead and he was the perpetrator. So what they'd be going after would be conspiracy charges for somebody, say Melanie, who might have conspired to give his address so that they could go after him. But in the grand scheme of things, they may feel like that's small fish. I don't know. And then how is it hearsay when an FBI investigator delivering the evidence collected during the investigation? It's still hearsay if it's something somebody told somebody else and they're not in court to testify. Even if it's the most trustworthy source compiling all the information and presenting it, it's still, he told me, or somebody told somebody else outside of the realm of testimony, and it's still hearsay. That's just the way our system works, is that we want the best and most reliable evidence. And that means that sometimes things that are really, really relevant don't come in because they can't be corroborated. And oftentimes the prosecution just has to figure out a way to get it in a different way. And a lot with some of these things, they'll get them in. They'll just get them in a different way. Thank you so much for sending congratulations to my daughter, Kirsten. Her wedding is on Saturday down in the LA area, next Saturday. And she and her fiance have been together since college, about 8 years. We are all the families have become very close. So it's a really joyful time for all of us, and we're all super excited about it. So I'm looking forward to going down and spending this really special week with her and getting things all ready and then having a big day on Saturday. So And I promise I will be posting pictures and showing her off and showing off the wedding. So you'll all get a glimpse at what I've been doing next week. I am going to try and continue to keep up on the trial and listen to the recordings and try really hard to keep up on things, and especially if there are any big developments. I am going to try and get my newsletter out so that you guys will be able to do a deep dive into what's been going on so far and what the jury instructions are going to be. And we'll be back the following week and into it full steam ahead. So, Dr. Michelle Foster, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Well, Ken Kesey went to University of Oregon, which is where my daughter went to college. And my husband and I are both Beavers. We're both Oregon State folks. And but Ken Kesey went to University of Oregon. The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is set at the Oregon Mental Hospital. It actually is closed now, but it was the Oregon Mental Hospital, and that's where it was set. It was filmed there, and in fact, many of the people who were in the film were actual patients at the mental hospital. Yeah, so it has a lot of history with my home state, and yeah, well, it's hard for me, I think, to understand why she has chosen not to use mental health as a defense, because I think that it is a reasonable thing to do. And I'm sure that it's been incredibly frustrating for her lawyers, because I think they really have felt all along that that her mental health is a factor in this. So it's been, I feel for them having to put on a defense and not being able to use the best evidence and the best approach. Thoughts about Audrey's testimony, given that she changed, but from the grand jury? Well, I don't know that there was any evidence that she changed. What Jim Archibald asked her was, why didn't you tell the grand jury this? Now, I've presented at grand juries before, a couple of times. And the prosecutor only has to put on enough evidence to convince the grand jury that there's probable cause. So it's not necessary for the prosecution to put on all evidence at the grand jury. They're only putting on evidence to prove that there's enough evidence to suggest that this defendant did this crime, and enough to bind them over for trial. So I just wanted to make sure I wasn't getting any texts from Michelle. So they don't necessarily have to put on all evidence, all potential evidence at the grand jury. Jim Archibald asked, why didn't you tell the grand jury that? She said, because I was afraid. I don't know. There were a lot of people around in the viewing area and that I talked with afterwards who said, I don't believe her. There were other people who said, well, of course she was afraid. Chad wasn't the only one of this group, and Chad and Lori, even though they're in jail, doesn't mean that other people aren't dangerous. And so it will be interesting to see what the jury does with this. I think for those of us who know so much about this case, it may have sounded a little unrealistic or unbelievable. I'm not sure it's going to hit that way with the jury. I think the jury is going to find her believable. She certainly was embarrassed, feeling like she'd been manipulated and taken advantage of, that she was naive, that she was gullible, and this having the same sort of regretful presentation that Zulema did. So I think the jury will believe her. I'm not sure that everybody else believed her, but um, we have to look at what the jury's going to say, and I think they're going to find her credible. Now, uh, I mean, in some ways, that information goes to bolster the idea that perhaps Lori was understood more about what was going on than she said. But does that comment in and of itself say Lori was complicit in the death of the children? I don't know. I mean, I suppose you could infer that she was there and that she participated, but I don't know. Question. The defense stated they weren't using mental health as a defense. So, what's Archie trying to accomplish by highlighting the craziness of the cult members? Well, it's a fine line because he's not ever saying she has a diagnosable mental illness, but he is trying really hard to highlight that she was being manipulated by Chad Daybell. I think that's where he's trying to go with it. I don't think that it's possible for him to be able to paint her as an unwilling, vulnerable victim, but certainly trying to suggest that Chad was the mover, was the puppet master, and Lori was vulnerable and believed him. So I think that's where he's trying to go with it. But it's a tightrope to walk because he can't say this poor mentally ill woman was taken advantage of by somebody who could very well be a sociopath. He can't do that because he can't bring up her mental illness because she said it's off limits. So, good questions. Thank you, Lori, for your wealth of information and knowledge. The best knowledge is shared knowledge. Oh, I agree completely. Some people say, "Oh, are you gonna you gonna not tell us things that you're gonna put in your book? Or are you gonna?" And the answer is no. I'm gonna tell you what I find out, and I'm gonna share what knowledge I have, and I think what makes it interesting is the perspective that I bring to it as a retired lawyer. But I'm going to give you all the information I get. I can't wait to meet everybody at CrimeCon either. I went to CrimeCon last year when I didn't know nearly as many people as I know now, having met a ton of people at the trial, lots of other creators, and lots of you all. And so I can't wait either. CrimeCon is going to be in Orlando in September. So you can look it up, crimecon.com, and it will tell you when it's going to be. I am hoping that I'm going to be able to launch pre-sales for the book at CrimeCon in 2024. So that is my goal. Anyway, I'm looking forward to going to CrimeCon too. I will be there and we will have a blast. I'm excited that it's going to be in Orlando, and that sounds to me like there's going to be lots of really fun things to do. So thanks. I will look forward to seeing you all there too. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, based on what you've seen, how would you rate the chance that this verdict will be overturned on appeal? Archibald seems to bank on it. Well, I think every defense attorney banks on it. I mean, I think that we're trained to preserve error and to preserve the basis for appeal. I mean, that's part of our job, and so I think he is banking on it. The chance the verdict will be overturned, I think I would say scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 5 or a 6, depending on how the appellate court interprets the case law on 404B evidence. So I would say maybe a 6. I think a little more possible than not. These are You guys are busting my chops tonight. These are good questions. My super chat question: why would they admit the podcast but not Ian's recordings? Okay, good question. Um, well, for one thing, it was the defense that wanted the podcast played. So the problem is, or the point is, that in that case, what happened was they wanted to play the podcast. The prosecution said, no, we're not really sure. And the judge said, okay, you can play it. I think that the actually what happened was the prosecution didn't put up that big a fight over playing it. And here was the reason why. I think they thought there was a possibility that that would open the door for them to play the recording of Joe Ryan of the podcast where Lori says, I was going to kill Joe Ryan, or get a temple recommend. So I think the reason the prosecution didn't put up a big fight about that was because they were thinking that if they went too far down the road, they'd be able to bring that other podcast in. So I think that's why they didn't put up a big fight, and the defense wanted to play it. So it was just the opposite over the podcast recordings. The defense said, well, we want to bring him in so that we can know exactly what we're cross-examining on. And the judge said, no, because there was hearsay on them. So let me see the podcast. To be honest, I would have to go back and listen to the judge's ruling on both of them, because it does sound a little inconsistent. And I can't dredge it up right now. I don't think I have in my notes those arguments. So I will have to go back and listen to the judge's rulings on both those so that I can explain that, because that's a good question, because they do seem a little inconsistent. And I will do that. And my moderators, please remind me that I promised to get that answer. I'm making a note of it right now. So please subscribe. We've had new subscribers every week. I attribute some of that to the fact that we have been on a couple of other really popular, I have been on a couple of other really popular sites, including Surviving the Survivor with Joel Waldman and Harvard lawyer Lee. And that has given everybody and that's brought me to the attention of people who hadn't seen me before. And we've just been going wild. So please hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and get those notifications so that when we go live, you'll get notified. All during the trial, we've been doing little short lives, and we've done a couple of surprise lives, and we'll keep doing those. I expect that I'll be trying to do some at least short lives next week, maybe. And if there are big developments, we will be bringing them to you. So you'll want to know when and get those notifications when you can. Again, thank you so much for spending Saturday with us. Thank you for your super chats and your donations. I know that the moderators really appreciate them. Hazelnut, I'm hoping those iCloud accounts have direct evidence to killing the children. Thanks to Maud Michelle tonight. Safe travels to you, and congrats to your daughter on her upcoming nuptials. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know that we're going to get direct evidence of the murders, but I think we may get some more mm, some more conspiracy connections that are going to make it clear who was directly involved. So I sure hope so. Conspiracy and um, circumstantial cases, you got to be right on top of them. So I'm hoping that we're in for seeing more information this next week. So Melanie P has already violated the judge's order. Can they put her on as a hostile and put her feet to the fire? That is an excellent question. Yeah, they could have her declared a hostile witness. And what that means is that then the prosecution can ask her leading questions if the judge says she's a hostile witness. Um, the problem is that if they put her on the stand, it's not they that are going to have the problem with her. The prosecution, they know what they want her to say and they know what she knows. So putting her on the stand and getting that information out of her isn't going to be a problem. But I think what's going to be the problem is the defense is going to go after her and they're going to just tear her up. And, we don't really want to see that happen. So, prosecution does not want to see that happen. They don't want to see the defense shred her. So I think they're going to try and protect her from that as long as they don't absolutely need her testimony. So what that tells me that they've sent her home and that they may not call her at all is that the information that she has is only it doesn't add anything major to the case. I guarantee that if she had some information that connected Lori directly to any of these murders, they would have fought hard to get her on the stand. So it just sort of tells me that she probably doesn't have that much to add beyond what Ian said. Oh my goodness, Lisa Galindo, thank you so much. You were so generous. Thank you. And I you got to know that it really does make a big difference for our mods. Michelle, this is all for you tonight. You do an amazing job. Yes, she does. And as always, she does a great job. And she's also been operating at a little bit of a disadvantage because I think she still can't hear me. So, and we couldn't get that technical thing worked out before we went live. So I think she's flying a little bit blind. But I appreciate her and Brenda both beyond belief. So, let's just see if we have one more question. Otherwise, we might just sign off for the night. Okay, last question. Shouldn't Melanice lose her immunity agreement if she had one, since she basically committed contempt of court by watching Brandon's testimony? Sure, and I think that might be the consequence if she has an immunity agreement. We don't know. We don't know, and we don't know whether if she does, it's in Arizona or here. So the judge could only, and the prosecution could only withdraw her immunity agreement if they're the ones that made it or if it was done here. So we don't know 100%, but we'll find out. Will they charge Melanice? I doubt it. The judge could hold her in contempt. And I think that's the reason they decided not to put her on the stand, because I think there was a good chance the judge was going to hold her in contempt. So, and that could mean, that could mean a couple of days in jail. It could mean a fine. It could mean a lot of things. So, I think the prosecution's decision was to not to. Let's see. There is a comment here. It says, according to Nate Eaton, Melanice was sent home by the prosecutor. I'm I'm sorry, I have to get closer here. So calling her a coward and a wimp is uncalled for. For some reason, they don't want her around. Oh, well, yeah, I don't think we don't know what the motivation was for Melanie's watching this footage. Um, and so I can't say whether she did it on purpose so she wouldn't have to testify, but that's what a lot of people think. And I can't disagree because I don't know. But I think the prosecution didn't want the risk. They didn't want the risk of her um, coming to court, her credibility being called out, the judge finding her in contempt, any of those things. They didn't want any of those distractions in their case. So I would have done the same thing. I would have said, go home. The sooner you're out of Idaho, the better. So, is there any evidence Chad's immediate family follows some of the bizarre beliefs Chad had set? We don't know for sure. But we do know that there have been times we've heard things that make us go, hmm. So one of those things is that when Chad and Tammy moved from Springville to Rexburg, Garth was going to BYU Provo. And he did not want to move. He did not want to move to Rexburg. He was happy going to college there, and he didn't really want to go to Rexburg. And at one point, Chad called him and said, there are dark spirits following you, trying to attach themselves to you, and you need to come home where I can protect you. That sounds a little bit, and Garth did. So that sounds a little bit like they buy at least some of it. But it's very hard to say at this point because they're 5 individuals, so we don't know what each one of his individual children thinks or feels. And they have been very cautious and stayed very far below the radar. So it's hard to say at this point. We might know more as Chad goes to trial, but we might not. So, but it is clear that Tammy deferred to him. I don't know whether she believed what he said and some of his unusual things and his business about his near-death experiences and being able to tell prophecy and all that. I don't know. But she certainly supported him as if she did. Well, I think we're getting very close to the end, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Yes, thanks for your patience and for helping and for bearing with us while we had some technical problems. Thank you for your generous donations tonight. I can't tell you how much we appreciate them. And thank you for over 1,400 people who joined us in live today. And please, I continue to say, if I didn't get to your question, because the chat does move fast and there are many things that we need to work on, such as maybe another moderator and maybe slowing the chat down a bit. But please, if I didn't answer your question, put it in the show notes below and I will answer them. I do my very best to try and answer every one of your questions. I do read all your comments and I do read the chat. And if for some reason you don't want to put your comments down in the chat, that it feels a little too public, email me. Our emails in the show notes and you can email me directly and I answer those as well. So thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for all your sweet good wishes for my daughter's wedding. And thank you for continuing to be a great community and so supportive. So we're going to say good night and I will see you in 2 weeks, if not sooner. Good night.